It's wonderful to be here, and I'm going to introduce you to this incredible panel, each of whom has both personal and professional expertise in the topics we'll be discussing today. So just briefly, I will introduce them. To start, we have Nagina Khalil, who is currently visiting professor at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law. She's former chief prosecutor of elimination of violence and harassment against women for the Attorney General's Office of the Republic of Afghanistan. She's also former professor of law at Rana University in Kabul, Afghanistan. Thank you so much for being with us today. And sitting next to her is Alejandra Cardenas, who's this is actually a great title, Senior Director of Legal Strategies, Innovation, and Research at the Center for Reproductive Rights. She also has a long experience working in the inter-American system on issues including abortion, transitional justice, and also sex trafficking. So thank you for being here as well. Sitting next to her is Christine Ryan, who is with an organization called the Global Justice Center, which I should know because it is often confused for my clinic, the Global Justice Clinic. However, this center has a really high profile doing work on abortion rights, gender-based violence, anti-gender movements more broadly and globally. She is the legal director there, and she's previously worked as a human rights advisor with the UN and the Irish government. Thank you for being here. And finally, Yifat Suskind, who's the executive director of Madre, who has worked with local women's organizations in really difficult circumstances. And I got to know Yifat through work in Haiti. And she's also worked with women's rights activists in Syria, Yemen, Iraq. It's a long list. Thank you for being here as well. So just a couple of maybe table setting things to say before we get started. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to be using a couple of different terms, including democratic backsliding and autocratization, which are terms that invoke a continuum. So think of the continuum from democracy over to authoritarianism. And it's important to think about that big picture. We're in a global decline right now. Many organizations that rate and use indicators and quantitative data to determine different countries' state of democracy or autocratization have said that we're in a global decline here. It's the 5th year in a row that rule of law has declined. It's 2022 found 58% of all countries having a decline in checks on government power, and 2/3 of all countries in 2022 saw a decline in human rights and fundamental freedoms. Change happens over time, though. It's not an on-off switch, and so conversations like this are crucial. Democracy and autocracy emerge out of trends, and they can be identified, named, and changed. What might begin with leaders who lack commitment to the democratic process, disrespect fundamental minority rights, and demonize their political opponents may end with frank authoritarianism or fascism. With those terms, we mean a political strategy or a tool set or a political regime that prefers ultranationalism over individual freedom, that constructs external and internal enemies that it demonizes, and it divides the polity in order to gain power and hold on to power. Other key elements include morally rationalized violence, the shunning of restrictions on personal freedom and individual dignity, and not just the shunning of them, but the taking of them away, embracing structures of oppression, and of course, glorifying heterosexual patriarchal families. This includes very centrally for our discussion today, limiting the roles of women, especially limiting their public role and defining their private roles. So we'll turn to the panel now. Each of you brings distinct experiences and expertise on this topic, and I wonder if you could, from your different spaces of geography, different conditions of governance, types of governments that you've worked with, and also different issues that you've worked on, can you each just tell us a bit about where you're coming from, What's your own story and what's your experience with these issues? Nagina, I'd love to start with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here and also in beautiful state of United States, New York. And I'm really felt honored to speak about what's going on about women's rights and also women's situation, especially in Afghanistan that I came from. I want to start about my story, a story that I came from a country and that I was the witness of 3 regimes. The first regime of Taliban in 1996, the second regime, Democracy and Republican in Afghanistan, and the third regime that, again, the Taliban came in 2021. As they mentioned, my name is Nagina. I was born and also grew up in Afghanistan, but in a very far province of Afghanistan called Ghor province that was located in west of Afghanistan and very conservative and male-dominated province in Afghanistan, and also most insecure place in Afghanistan. I remember the first regime of Taliban that they came in power in 1996, and I was a kid. And that time, my mother, that she was an educated person, and also my father, who was engineer, they both of them didn't have work because the Taliban banned work from the people, and also my mother was a teacher. She was not allowed to go to school and also universities because in that time, the Taliban closed all of education institution in Afghanistan, and women were not allowed to go to work, and also women were not allowed to study and anything. Like they erased from all of public life. And that time it was my biggest dream to go one day in a school, and my mother told me about her story. How was the university that she went, and also how was she was good, like, you know, when she get educations. And she told us, me and other my siblings, it was a dream for me to go to school and to see like how is the school and to read and also write. And it was impossible in that time. My cousins, millions of girls in Afghanistan in that time, there was also deprived of education and also working in that time. And after that, in 2001, when the United States and also international community and NATO came in Afghanistan, they brought for us hope, and our dreams came true. And me and also my sisters were the first girls that went to school in my province, and my mother was the first female teacher in that school. Still, that was a lot of problems for us and also for the girls because the families, they didn't want to allow their daughters to go to and get education. They said it comes from the Western countries and they want to get the culture of Western and also change the beliefs. And that was like a concern for the people, but that was not a reason because they afraid if the women get education and they're afraid if the women know their rights. But by day, the number of women and girls increased in school and universities. And the first time we saw a woman and candidated for herself as a presidency in Afghanistan, there was Ministry of Foreign Women Affairs. We had women in parliament, we had women in universities and every part of the country. And that time I was at high school and I started to write an open letter for Barack Obama that he was president in that time in the United States. And I said, thank you for all of the people of United States to came in Afghanistan and also gave us this opportunity to go back to school and also study and get education. And after that, I also started to working as a journalist. Even I was not that much young, but I started to work in national TV and also national radio in Ghor province that just wanted to change the situation and give the women, and especially for the girls, to encourage to come in the society and to start working in the public life. My mother changed her work, and also she started working with an organization for children's rights with my father. I remember all of those days. It's in front of my eyes, and that was, I think, the bright and like the good memory of my life that I was in that time in Afghanistan. And not just for me, for millions of girls, because they had the opportunity to go to school. After that, after school, I had concurrent examinations, and my mother asked me to be a doctor because there was no female doctor in that place. I think most of the parents in Afghanistan, that they want their kids be doctor or engineer. Yes, but in that time I said I saw many violence against women in that province, and even in our house, my cousins and also other family members, a lot of domestic violence. And I said, okay, I want to be the voice of women. For me, there was two options. The first one to be a journalist, and the second one be a lawyer. And I selected to be a lawyer. And fortunately, also I got in Herat University and I get my bachelor degree in law school. I went to law school, and it was also another problem for me and also for my family. I know being a woman is challenging around all of the world, but being a woman in Afghanistan is more challenging. It's very hard to be a woman in Afghanistan and also study in Afghanistan and work in Afghanistan in that situation. There was a lot of things against me and also my family, and they said, why you cannot allow to go to alone in your university, and you should stay in your house, and also it's okay for you that you had your high school diploma, no need for extra educations. But my mother said no, she will go and also she will get her education. So I went to law school and finished law school, and then I had the opportunity to came to the United States. There was a competition, Phillips Jessup moot court competitions, and it was against the other challenge. The people said it was against Islam. A woman go around without mahram, like male chaperone, in another countries. But my family gave me this opportunity. When I came here in the US, I got impressed, honestly. When I see women leadership, when I see freedom of speech here, freedom of expressions, and a lot of other freedoms in the United States, it inspired me and impressed me to go back to my country. Even in 2016, the situation was not good in Afghanistan. So many of my friends told me, do not come back to Afghanistan, stay in the US and apply for asylum or go to Canada and start a new life. And I said, no, I have a commitment with my country, and especially for the women of Afghanistan, I want to go back. And I went back to Afghanistan and started my job as a first female prosecutor in Ghor province, and started investigation, many cases regarding violence, honor killing, and forced marriage, early marriage. That's a normal thing in Afghanistan, unfortunately, in that time, and wanted to be the voice of women and bring justice for them. Before me, there was no woman in the prosecution office, but there was also not that much case regarding violence against women. And after, as I appointed as a prosecutor, every day I had many cases regarding violence against women. It was not that much that the violence increased. It was because the female and also the women understand about their rights, and they know there is a woman for them to fight for their rights. And that's why there was a trust, and they came for me and also gave me their complaints and said they wanted that justice and also to be free. That was a good part of my life because I served for my people and especially for the women. And in that time, I received many threats from the Taliban, and not just from the Taliban, from the people of Ghor province. They demonstrated against me, and they shouted to the government and said, we don't want women in a prosecution office. And the reason they said it's against Islam, because women are not allowed to be judge and prosecutor. Even it's not in Islam and also in Quran. But all of these challenges, I fight for that, and I said, no, I want to work. And even my life was in danger. My family was in danger and at great risk. And every day we receive a lot of threats by phone, by letters, and even my family got targeted, and I myself as well. But I didn't stop. I just wanted to work and bring like justice for the women. After 1 year, I got the opportunity and a scholarship from United States and came here to continue my higher education and get my master's degree in rule of law and good governance. in 2018. And again, I went back Afghanistan and I started my work as a director of juvenile prosecution office at Attorney General Office of Afghanistan. And beside of that, I was also professor of law at Rana University. That was why I chose to be a professor and also a lawyer, because I wanted to change the student life and also the student mindset regarding women and also about human rights in Afghanistan. It's very hard to work in Afghanistan as a woman, like they are not like unfortunately many of the people, they are not seeing you as a human, and it's very hard like to work with. They are seeing you like, in a second person, like a second gender, always like treat with you, and they say the woman, they don't have ability to work, the woman, they don't have ability to be in leadership, and also especially many of the women that they were in high leadership, also in the cabinet, most of them, they were like a symbol, because even the president, they didn't believe on women rights in Afghanistan. So I said, okay, the education is the key, and also the student is the basic, like, to change the society. It's a good one for me to teach human rights and also gender subject for them to know, and also just to behave with them as a human. And they changed a lot. My students get a lot of things, and they behave with respect with women, and especially with their classmates. And that was a great honor for me. After that, my last job was as a senior elimination of violence and harassment against women in Attorney General Office of Afghanistan. And I again started many cases regarding violence against women in Afghanistan and harassment in public and also in private sectors. All of these achievements, we had women judges, we had women prosecutors, we had women leaders, even not just in master, PhD professors, and in parliament, mayor and ministers, they are all in women. And in Afghanistan, we had a huge development regarding women rights in Afghanistan. Of course, there was a lot of problems, but after 1996, it was a huge development and improvement for women rights in Afghanistan. But what happened again, like in 2021, all of these achievements, all of this development went to zero. And again, the life started again what happened in 1996. And I see, like, even today, there is a lot of problems in Afghanistan in front of women. And the story of me is story of thousands of girls in Afghanistan. Even like when I was born, and my father and my family, they had two other daughters, and my siblings, they were daughters. So my father didn't want another more daughter and girls. And that's why when I born and they saw that I was a girl, he was so upset. And he wanted to give me for other cousins. So, this is like the open-minded person. And think about the other people who are living in districts and also in like villages in Afghanistan, and they don't have access to educations, and they don't know anything about the women's rights. Now think about those women that they don't have voice in Afghanistan, and they don't have access to anything. They erase from public lives and also from public societies, not just in politicals. And think about those women that their biggest dream is today is just to go to again a school and also university and restart to educations. This is not easy to talk about these issues in Afghanistan nowadays, but at least I can say the only thing that we can change a society is the women of the society. And if I'm talking today here, if I'm here, it's because of education. It was because of democracy, and it was because of freedom and human rights. But nowadays, if we shut up it is shut up in Afghanistan, shut down all of these things, and think if it continues for 10 years or 5 years, what will happen in the country by the name of Afghanistan? And what will happen about the half population of Afghanistan, millions of girls and women that they are stuck in their lives, and also they are stuck in their house. And think about those women that they were breadwinner in the house, and now they don't have any job, and also they don't have right to work. And this is all the story of those women that they are there, but I hope like today I can bring their voice here and think about what's going on in Afghanistan and what we can do as a woman for the women in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Alejandra, we'd love to hear from you.
It is on, right? Oh, yeah, it is. Thank you again for inviting me. I am both a U.S. citizen, but I'm also Colombian. I was born and raised in a small city in the southwest of the country. It's one of the regions that has suffered most severely the impact of a long-term internal armed conflict. And it is also, it's called El Cauca, and it is also a region that is highly politicized, like in the sense of people being very political. We have the birth of the Afro-descendants movement and the indigenous rights movement took place there, and it's still very much strongly there, influences everyday life. And I was also raised by a feminist, and she was a community leader. So I grew up actually attending the women's rights conference that she helped put together that were not like the one we're having right now. They were very low key, very grassroots. But it was fascinating, and I am very lucky to have had that experience because I witnessed growing up what it looked to have democratic processes being colored or being led by women and being actually be feminist. We were having discussions growing up all the time about what the place of women's rights was in the struggle of women's farmers, working class, and racialized women. So by the time I was a teenager, I was a very active participant in the sexual and reproductive rights network that had been created by these wonderful women. And Colombia went through a wonderful process of thinking what democracy was like in the early 90s when the country, led by a youth movement actually, finally was pushed to change a constitution that we had that was made at the end of the 19th century, where obviously there were no concept of human rights the way we think of that today, where women were not seen as people, etc. And it was a wonderful process to create a constitution that really incorporated human rights and that was able to put front and center a lot of the discussions that the feminist movement wanted to put forward. So I have that initial background of being in grassroots movements and feminist movements, but then I became a lawyer. And besides my activism, I started becoming involved in human rights litigation. And I actually started doing indigenous rights litigation. That's the first thing I did. And just social and economic rights litigation. And by now I've been doing this for over 20 years, mostly in Latin America, although not exclusively. And I work in both the small NGO in Colombia, the big INGO, like the one I am now, obviously a Center for Reproductive Rights. And I also work at the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, where I manage the docket of cases and friendly settlements that at the time the Inter-American Human Rights System had for Peru and Bolivia. Peru, a country that had just gone through return to democracy, and we were dealing with all the transitional justice processes of that after being under an authoritarian government, the regime of Fujimori, from the late 80s to the early 90s. In Bolivia, who had just gone through a very interesting democratic process led by the indigenous rights movement, and that elected the first indigenous president in a country where indigenous constitute the vast majority of the population. So yeah, and obviously in my role now, I work mostly on reproductive rights, not exclusively on Latin America, and we are proud of support is some of the things that I wish I hope I can talk to today, supporting wonderful feminist social movements in Latin America.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll just take yours. Thanks. Thank you. So thanks so much for having me here today. My accent will tell you all where I'm from pretty quickly. I'm from Ireland, and I came to abortion rights work from Ireland at a time when there was still the most strict abortion ban in the world was live in Ireland when I left. And I wanted to study abortion rights movements and basically get a better understanding of how to confront them, but think about it from a scholarly lens. And I came to North Carolina in the United States and quickly realized that there were many parallels with what was happening in North Carolina and the history of abortion in Ireland. So I came to the United States to work on a PhD looking at social movements for and against abortion and feminist legal approaches. And without meaning to, but that work led me to really excavate where abortion sat in the context of Ireland's history and state building. Very much, and we'll get into it more later on, but I agree with the thesis that Jen set out, is that what ostensibly might look like a functioning democracy often has elements that are autocratic, particularly for women. And Ireland is a serious case study for that. The abortion ban that existed in Ireland was inserted into the constitution via a fetal personhood law in 1983. So it was a relatively recent phenomenon. And interestingly for the audience here, when the anti-choice actors were drafting the amendment to the Constitution, they were in very close contact with Americans United for Life here in the United States, who at the time felt that Roe v. Wade could never be overturned, but if they could enshrine fetal personhood into a constitution somewhere, it might be a harbinger of things to come. And they succeeded in doing so in Ireland with relative ease. What was interesting and also very depressing about what they achieved was that it was essentially a preemptive strike on liberalization in the country, particularly for women. It came on the heels of final recognition for the right to contraception in Ireland just for married couples, and it wasn't available, from the local doctor. I'm a child of one of six, so it was not available everywhere. And in addition to that, it really was an attempt to forestall any strength that the women's movement was gaining. Ireland had just joined the EU. They'd been forced by virtue of joining the EU to insert equality laws throughout the country, allowing women to go to work after they were married, which was banned if you worked for the public service, elements like that. So in response to the possibility of a changing society, the right-wing actors and those who were stalwarts of Catholic theology and nationalism in the country created this abortion ban that was so severe it wasn't replicated anywhere in the world for years. And what it required was for women to either maintain unwanted pregnancies, or those who could, to go abroad and in secret and in a very stigmatized way to access abortion care in the UK or elsewhere, or in later years to take abortion pills, which was a lifesaver for many. And despite the fact that women were in large part able to access abortion in these very creative ways, where they were actively resisting these dictates that were being placed on women and on their lives. Through my research, it was very clear that, as in many states around the world, restrictions on abortion are very much attempts to re-entrench certain forms of gender ideology into the state. Now that term has been, weaponized by anti-rights actors to describe freedoms for women and LGBT people, but that's essentially what they are. These are legislative tools to proscribe the role of women and to punish women who try to resist those roles, whether it's through criminalization. In the Irish case, it was exile abroad for those who wanted to realize their freedom. And, I think we'll get into it later, but I do have a happy ending to that story, in that in 2018, the feminist movement in Ireland was finally successful in overturning those years and years of oppression. But it took a long time to get there, and abortion rights were almost the last bastion of that Catholic nationalism autocracy that existed in the country.
Everybody's on? Not on. How about now? There we go. Good morning, everybody. I'm Yifat again, and I'm originally from Israel, and I kind of came of age politically in activist work there, working both with folks in the Palestinian movement to end the occupation, and also in a kind of fringy part of the Israeli left around democratization within Israeli society, which there means working to transform Israel from a kind of ethno-religious state to a state for all of its citizens, the way we think of liberal democracy generally anywhere in the world. And one of the through lines that was really salient, both on the left in Israel and in the Palestinian movement, though even the more progressive parts of the Palestinian movement, is that people were told that feminist concerns needed to take a back seat to more pressing national issues. So something that we hear all around the world all the time. And I've been thinking a lot lately about that lack of intersectionality, that lack of inclusivity, watching the movement that has taken hold in Israel in the last few months against backsliding democracy, because it kind of has that same message of like, wait your turn in regards to Palestinians, including the almost 17% of people inside of Israel who are Palestinian. Right, so the logic is like, let's stabilize Israeli democracy and then we'll get around to the so-called Palestinian question. And, it's a deeply flawed kind of approach to democracy movements, right? Because if you want a vibrant pro-democracy movement, then the people with the fewest democratic rights really need to be at the center. They need to be leading. And of course, in Israel, the people who are working to weaken democratic institutions, as Meg was talking about, are doing that in order to strengthen their grip on Palestinian land, right? To prevent the Israeli Supreme Court from overturning like a move towards annexation, for example. And those people, like we see in lots of parts of the world, those kind of extreme nationalists are allied with a theocratic agenda that is working to roll back rights for women, for LGBT people. And for that reason, Israeli feminists are very much at the forefront of these like now weekly, very militant pro-democracy, so-called pro-democracy movements and demonstrations that we're seeing. And, we could talk more about like why it is that feminists are always out in front, but it's true in like all of the countries, that we're coming from and many others. And I think there it kind of remains to be seen whether the Israeli women's movement will really work to more successfully expand and radicalize the demonstrations that we're seeing right now. But also I think important as we're thinking about backsliding democracy and what works and what doesn't in combating authoritarianism, important to note that what we're seeing there right now is a movement that is fighting for liberal democracy for Israeli Jews and at least willing to tolerate apartheid for Palestinians, because what they are really working to do, and we saw some of this here during the Trump years as well, is to reestablish a status quo, right? And I think that, I think about the work that I do now at Madre, and part of the reason that I moved from that context to come here and do work more globally with grassroots women's organizations was in order to do political work that really upheld the right to self-determination, but also understood the centrality of intersectional feminism to every single social movement that we want to see succeed. And a lot of the groups that we work with now in these countries that my colleagues on the panel are working in, and many others, are, like I said, sort of out in front of these movements for democracy and against autocracy and theocracy in across really diverse contexts. And I think what they have in common is that they all are kind of holding this question that I think as advocates and activists makes sense for us to be asking as well, which is, when we are in a situation of backsliding democracy, how do we organize so that we are creating something more transformative than an oppressive status quo? And I think requires a lot of discernment to be able to do something better than just turn the clock back to, before the abortion ban, or before, Trump is holding office, or, what have you. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and thinking about like how we support and work with these movements, and really thinking that about just the sheer utility of intersectional feminism in the way that Black feminists in this country and in other parts of the world kind of conceived, and that is now, ours to like develop and work with in this conversation and in the organizing work that we're doing.
Let's actually pick up right there. You thought that was really helpful, and sort of take that intersectional lens and ask, okay, we know that fascist governments, that authoritarian governments hate women, right? They use that discourse, they put in place anti-women legislation, they take away the law licenses of women in one fell swoop, as an example. But we also then know, as you just said, that women's rights are attacked in democracies as well. How does that impact, and how can we use the intersectional lens you're talking about to think about allies, to think about movement strategy? How does picking up with that insight that you just made, how does that change or impact your plans going forward? Would you like to start by just continuing what you were saying? And then we can go backwards that way. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think one really important place to start is with what you said before, Meg, about needing to kind of not accept the bifurcation of democratic and autocratic contexts, which is how that framing is created in the media and by liberal governments a lot of times, who would really like us to put our attention out there and think about, all the terrible things that are happening in Afghanistan, in wherever, and not take note of, the ways in which authoritarian and autocratic and even theocratic tendencies are, gaining ground inside of the US or inside of whatever context we're thinking about. So, and I'm thinking here of like work that we did with women in northern Iraq who were under ISIS control a few years ago. The whole northern part of Iraq was occupied by ISIS. And we were working with women's organizations who were resisting the really violent forms of policing of gender expression by ISIS, which were almost universally condemned, right? It was really hard to find a government that would stick up for ISIS. And yet when we would talk to women in the rest of Iraq, in the nominally democratic parts of that country, they would say, yeah, it's great that everyone is criticizing ISIS, but what about what happens to women and LGBT people all the time in the rest of Iraq? And they were able to, very saliently make these connections about the continuity between violations like sexual enslavement under ISIS and forced early marriage, which, like in Afghanistan, happens routinely in Iraq and is not just tolerated, but institutionalized in many ways by the government. Same with the killings of LGBT people or people perceived to be, not gender conforming by ISIS, all these extrajudicial killings, but also the assassination of LGBT people in the rest of Iraq by militias very closely allied with political parties sitting in parliament. So, and then as organizers, they were able to do this brilliant thing, which was to leverage that near universal condemnation of ISIS to say to their own government and the whole world, if you don't like what ISIS is doing, then you should be pressuring the Iraqi government. And because these things have more in common than they look more the same than they do different, right? And those demands for women's rights in particular were incorporated into the pro-democracy movement that kind of culminated in 2019 in the ouster of the Iraqi prime minister. The Iraqi parliament now has before it the first ever draft law to criminalize domestic violence. These are some of the outcomes of that organizing. And I think, a couple lessons for us, with our activist hats. One is really important to think about authoritarianism from the perspective of people who are most in the crosshairs of those violent movements, because that's how we can best see the continuity that exists that we're talking about. And also, the other thing that the Iraqi women did at great risk to themselves was insist on rights for LGBT people. And that community in Iraq is so under attack that you can't really even speak of an Iraqi LGBT movement, right? We're in a bit of a pre-movement moment for that movement. But the women's movement has done something instructive for all of us, I think, which is to leverage this very small margin of safety that women have, because women are not allowed to have rights, but they are allowed to exist, which is not true for LGBT people. So to take that little margin of safety that they have and use that to extend support and protection to LGBT people has been really, really critical. And what that does also is expand the tent that you're working with and create more allies, even if those allies are so much at risk that they can't be public about who they are. So I'll pause there, but those are, a couple things that come to mind.
Thanks very much. First of all, to reiterate the point that you've both made in terms of drawing strict lines between what's happening in an ostensible democracy and elsewhere in the world is really dangerous for movements who are working within these semi-autocratic states who aren't grappling with the fact that they're working against a bigger state, fundamental problems with how the state is constructed. And you also see that, in terms of the democracy autocracy divide, but also in terms of theocracy and what we consider to be, even among activists and human rights groups, and I saw this when I worked at the UN, what even our norms consider to be a harmful traditional practice in part of the world that needs to be condemned. There is so often that application of, oh, this is a religious or a cultural matter, is applied to non-Western states, whereas what the different forms of violence and misogyny that constrict women's rights in Western states is just as harmful a traditional practice, whether it's been the denial of contraception, the denial of reproductive rights, or the stigmatization of persons with minority sexual orientation and gender identity. It permeates both democracies and autocracies. So the labels that we apply to different states are often very unhelpful, whereas if you were to take a step back and look at what the type of harm that is being imposed on individuals and communities, from that level, you're working without needing to use these labels. To get to the point then that you were both talking about in terms of a coordinated response and intersectionality, To give I think I was, asked to be here to talk a little bit about the Irish abortion movement because it is, one success story in recent years. For decades, the feminist movement had no allies in Ireland, and in part that was because the state and the Catholic Church had been so successful in stigmatizing this issue and denying any space to talk about abortion as a right or as an issue of economic justice, social justice, even restorative justice in terms of how the state had treated women for years and years. But what was really different about the last 5 years of the campaign and the success was that feminists were able and successful to get other movements on board. So whether that was the labor movement, working very closely with migrant justice groups, those who had campaigned for marriage equality in the country successfully in 2015, then transferred their lessons and their energy to abortion. And at the time, people didn't think that that was going to be possible. But those who were at the center of the movement and those who were most impacted by the abortion ban knew that this was not an impossible ask, that their power, their different levels of advocacy, whether they were engaging with the government or engaging internationally or with young voters, at every level it was necessary to draw upon the experiences of a wide range of people in society. And whether that was people at the margins or, as sometimes happens in feminist campaigns for abortion, those who are more palatable to the public eye, who have equally experienced horrendous abuses of their human rights. So, I'm thinking about even now you see with the newspapers in the US, there's a lot of attention given to women who can appear with their partner on their side and talk about a wanted pregnancy that they've lost, and needing that story is really powerful, and I wouldn't detract from it in any way. But what I saw in the feminist movement for abortion in Ireland was that they had to be very careful not to just put those voices forward and those stories forward. It was equally important to consider, to deliver on the promise of this being a campaign for women's equality, for liberalization for the country, to also engage with migrant communities, those who were from socioeconomic classes that, are dismissed time after time, the travellers movement in Ireland. And I think that was the strength of the movement overall. There'll be fault lines at different points, and there'll be division in movements, but I think that, the evidence is pretty clear that I think you said it earlier, if you are fighting for a type of liberalization and real democracy, you have to prioritize those who have the least access to and the inability to exercise their democratic rights in the first place.
Thank you. I think of the 3 examples that I wanted to talk about today. So Chile, it's a country that had for the longest time a law that criminalized abortion point blank, right? Like there were no exceptions for criminalization. How did they go from that to in 2017 approving a law that allows for some exceptions? And how did they go now to a couple of years, some years later, being in the process of rewriting their constitution to reimagine reproductive health within that? Colombia also had a complete ban, a complete criminalization of abortion. 2006 took a step towards liberalization. And just last year, basically reframed the whole system to have one of the most progressive legislations in the entire world. Abortion is now not just legal and on demand up to 24 weeks, and after that, with some exceptions, you can access as well, but it is part of a state obligation to provide healthcare, so it's public and it doesn't matter who you are or what's the status of your healthcare insurance, you will get access. How did Argentina went from having an exceptions regime that was very strict to allowing more access for women who were victims of rape in 2012, to starting one of the biggest social movements in Latin America, the Green Wave, in 2018, and having finally a law in 2021 that allows for abortion on request. What they all have in common is that they are a proof of how crucial an intersectionality approach to those processes was and is. So Argentina, let me just say this first. There would have been no transit to democracy the way it was in the 80s for a country that was under a dictatorship for a long time, if the mothers of Plaza de Mayo would not have existed. All these mothers and old ladies with white handkerchiefs that day after day were protesting the dictatorship and demanding that the bodies of their missing kids show up. That the feminist movement in Argentina is definitely, to some extent, the result of that history. In 2018, it's a very pivotal moment because a 14-year-old was assassinated by her 16-year-old boyfriend when he found out she was pregnant. In Latin America, is home to 14 of the 25 countries with the highest rates of feminicide in the world. Very quickly after this, social movements began. It was obviously coordinated by the feminist movement, but women from all backgrounds who had never participated politically started coming out to the streets under the slogan of Ni una menos, not one less. So something that started as some protests here and there became a whole movement that spread out through Latin America. And then it was so powerful that in 2018, they transformed that with the green handkerchief. That is why we took out the green wave, because the green handkerchief became like the symbol of that. They continue a conversation that they had started around this discussion around feminicide, which was violence against women. And they said, not allowing women to get abortions is part of that violence. So they, all the time, they were talking about feminicide, but they were explaining what the connection with not allowing women to having an abortion was, for example. Domestic violence, abortion. So they, another interesting thing is, and not so many people know this, is that the movement started organizing itself organically. It was multi-generational. And it was also very intersectional in its approach. So they were like, hey, you are a woman and you're part of this union. You're a union leader. Why are you not talking about this with us? Come talk to us about this. But how does this relate to your struggle too? So they started incorporating a class analysis. What does this mean for working women? And that was constantly part of it. So we not just acknowledge that poor women are not able to pay for private abortions that are safe, even though they are clandestine. We analyze and we denounce what's behind all of that injustice. And that was constantly there. And it was so strong that the now president had to campaign on a promise that he was going to pass the bill, and he did. Let's go to Chile. 2011, I think it's important to go to 2011. There was what was known as a civic awakening. So there's a huge student movement that year, mass protest, demanding public education. But as part of that movement, feminists start organizing within that youth-led movement, and they start talking about what does gender have to do with this. And some years later, the then president Michelle Bachelet managed finally to pass a law that allow for some exceptions to the abortion law. But what's interesting is that the movement didn't wind up after that. It was the opposite. It just became more emboldened and stronger and more intersectional and democratic in its approach. In 2019, when I don't know if you remember reading this in the news, but Chile basically became like everything, life stopped because there was what also was known as a social explosion, and there were huge like marches almost every day, and they took over public space for months. And feminists were very much at the core of this. Very much at the core. If you read through what the petitions were, you're gonna see how intersectional it was. So there were demands for further liberalization of abortion, but they were also demands for universities depatriarchalizing the curricula. Universities depatriarchalizing the teacher, the professors, the professorial body. And it was also a moment of solidarity with environmental movements, and also a rejection of what they denounced as a neoliberal system that had eroded a lot of the basic rights that they were all demanding. And in Colombia, I won't go into so much detail, but it was the same. So same year, actually, huge protests erupted, and the feminist movement took center stage in that articulation, in those demands. And that was critical because it just basically made it so there was enough political pressure for politicians and also for the Constitutional Court to feel that they had a friendly environment to issue a very progressive decision. I think just because I think it's so beautiful, I don't know if you had never watched this. I recommend that you go online at YouTube and watch a pivotal moment in the protest in Chile, which was when this performance group called La Tesis did the performance Rapist in Your Path. That was also a huge part of that political movement. Let me just read very quickly some of the lyrics in the song of the performance. They said, "Patriarchy is a judge that judges just for being born, and its punishment is the violence it inflicts on us." It says, "The rapist is also the judge, the court, the president. This oppressive state is a rapist macho." At a moment in which people were brutally repressed for protesting, it was extremely politically powerful. So how important is it? I think it's everything. I just don't think that there won't be any type of revolution without feminism, but we cannot also be a single issue movement and think that we are going to really change anything culturally when patriarchy predates everything, including capitalism. If we don't understand that our struggles are intertwined, and if we don't understand that these are all issues that are not just our issues.
This is such a rich conversation, and I recognize that sadly we're having to move on. I will not cut you off, Negative, definitely. But I just want to forgive you all for us not having enough time, because obviously we could go much deeper with each of you. Negative, you could just take a couple minutes, and then I will have some questions from the audience.
Yes, I just want to give you the recent example of like Afghanistan, what happened, and also during the democracy, and also in a authoritarian government, and during the Taliban, under the Taliban. The first one, I and also many other women, as a woman activist and also human rights defender in Afghanistan, there was no law for criminalizing the domestic violence in Afghanistan in like 20 years ago. But there was a huge movement for women's rights in Afghanistan, and I was part of that. We came together and also pursued an advocacy in the parliament and also with the president to ratify a law, elimination of violence against women. Even with a lot of huge advocacy in the parliament, we were not success to get the approval from the parliament of Afghanistan. But by the way, the president ratified it without the consent of the parliament, and it was just the result of advocacy and movement for that law. In the meantime, there was no woman in the Supreme Court of Afghanistan in long time in Afghanistan. We came together, and again, there was a lot of movement and advocacy for that, to have a woman as a member of Supreme Court in Afghanistan, and we succeeded. And nowadays, in the recent, before the collapse of Afghanistan, there was no woman as a deputy of governor in the provinces. There was a huge advocacy and movement, and convince the government and especially the president to accept it should be necessary and also a mandatory to the one deputy of the governor should be a woman, and he accepted and just started to be that one as well. Nowadays, when the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, there is 39 decrees that they had and also ordered in Afghanistan, and all of them is about just to eliminate and also eliminate women in Afghanistan and eliminate rights of women rights in Afghanistan. It starts from elimination and banning of educations to freedom and work, and also forced hijab in full cover hijab in Afghanistan. As you see in the media, you may see also the women journalists in the media, they should wear a mask during the show, and also they should not allowed to use different colors, just black color. And also in the universities, they said no women are allowed to go to university, and also secondary school. It's about 19 months that they are in the control of the Taliban, and the women are deprived of educations. But one thing that we see now, even with all of these problems and challenging in Afghanistan, like authoritarian government of Taliban and dictatorship and conservative people, the only people and also that they are in front line is now women of Afghanistan. We see every day there is no single day that the women are not in the street and also just shouting their rights and also get freedoms and also wants educations and work. And it's incredible because in that country with like huge security issues and also death risks and also tortures, kidnapping, even raping, in Afghanistan they are coming in the street and just want their freedoms and also education and work. I think this is a big lesson for all of us, and even for those people we like here and in the United States, to see just the woman now it's not like the previous woman, because most leaders and also women activists, they left the country when the Taliban took power in Afghanistan. But this is now the new civil society and also new women rights activists that they came in the street and just fighting for their fundamental rights, not just for their rights, they are also fighting for human rights in Afghanistan and just want their freedoms from the Taliban, and asking from international community and especially United States, because they had a 20 years of history in being in Afghanistan and also spending billions of dollars for capacity building and also women's rights in Afghanistan, and then left everything and in the oceans and to zero. It's a great opportunity, a responsibility for all of us to see and also to support those women that they are now in Afghanistan and struggling with these problems and challenges in that country.
No.
Try this. Thanks. This is on?
No, but maybe.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions and we're going to take the time to respond to them. So the first question is about the fact that most of these democracy indices or rule of law measures don't actually account for what happens when women's rights are not respected. And the writer of the question very helpfully notes that one data set, VDEM, does reduce scores for that. But if that's a sign of how we don't see women's rights as absolutely central to democracy, what should we do to ensure it is central, especially going into 2024 when there's going to be an unprecedented number of elections in the world?
Is it on?
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's first of all, there's often a problem with these indicators that have historically been designed without taking account of gender, and it's points to the fact that whatever you're measuring, you do have to, you've heard it many times today, apply an intersectional lens. I think just to flip it a little bit, and I hate to, say that feminists need to do more. They're doing loads, but perhaps sometimes I think that we do end up quite naturally focusing energy on certain issues over others, when in fact many of these issues, whether it's access to healthcare, better working conditions, rights for minorities, you're fighting not just for those segments of society to improve, but you're fighting against an autocratic state. You're fighting against an attempt by the right to overtake your society. So to the extent that feminists can see themselves as being part of that fight, and I think, as many of us do here, think about the US and how many, I think some of the journalists who've made these connections are here in the room, really showing how the attacks on reproductive rights, on voting suppression, on the incarceration of Black bodies, of immigrants, that's all part of an attack and a power grab by a minority. And so to the extent that feminists have the energy to position themselves somewhere else, is really to show that while women's rights are absolutely central and have for too long been sidelined, those who are fighting against that type of autocratic state and for a real democratic state are working together against a right that is extremely dangerous.
Do you want me to answer as well? Yeah, I'll just add something because, I'm thinking about the fact that we're sitting in a university, and I think that part of what's really relevant to the question is that we are missing data and we are missing a kind of knowledge production, because we all understand that people measure what matters, and to the extent that women don't matter, that's not part of the data, right? And it's really hard to make policy without data, really, really hard. And like you said, feminists are doing loads. It's not the job of activists out in the street necessarily to work on that kind of knowledge production, but it is the job of people in this room. And it's really, really critical. We have, Jennifer mentioned Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's research that shows us, for example, that nonviolent movements are more than twice as likely to achieve their goals against authoritarians as violent uprisings. And that when those movements are led by women, they're almost twice as likely to remain peaceful, which is key. That having that kind of scholarship and that kind of research is what lets those of us who are trying to move agendas as activists really have wind at our back and an ability to advocate successfully with policymakers.
Thanks very much. So another question here, this one, in Ireland and Germany, the constitutions explicitly speak of the importance of motherhood in society. These commitments to maternity fueled more restrictive abortion policies, but they also met with demands for greater state support for motherhood. Might we see a similar turn here in the US, or if you'd like to take it to another place also? Alejandra, would you like to answer this one?
So Yeah, but I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, so the question is if it's a good thing or it's a double-edged sword?
I think it's a double-edged sword. Exactly, yes.
Okay. So what I would say is that it's something that I myself have also been self-critical and critical of the movement, because I think that it's also our fault that we have isolated the issue of abortion from other reproductive rights issues. And what a shame if the fight for your right to parent and your right to give birth the way you choose to give birth is taken by the Christian right. These are fights that we should be fighting. Why did we stop fighting for maternity leave? What happened? In the US, I'm saying. I'm now on my hat as a US citizen. So I think that it can be, of course it can be a double-edged sword, because they have been so good at co-opting, like they own families, and it's like, no, right? It's
Just super quickly, I think the remedy to that is the reproductive justice movement. And so just want to draw attention to that, again, like part of the sort of political intellectual heritage from Black feminism. But that's how we get around that gap.
Just to come in super quickly, because Ireland's potential, the clause does presently exist about the support for motherhood, but that didn't translate into economic support in the way that you might think. So for example, my own mother raised 6 children, but if she doesn't have access to a state pension like other workers do, and that was work that should be valued in society. I doubt there's a whole lot of disagreement of that, but there's a whole generation of women like her who are facing poverty because the work that they were mandated to do in the home was not economically supported. And even now, they're struggling now after serving the state for all these years.
I just got the note that time is up. So what I want to say is thank you, each of you, for these wonderfully rich comments. Also to take the Black feminist insight of intersectionality and to carry it forward for the rest of the day, I think would be really helpful for us. Thank you, and I think I'm handing it over to Jen now.
Kind of easier down here. And I was just going to say exactly that, Meg. I think the rest of the conversation for the afternoon is going to be on a really extraordinary arc. But thank you so much to all of you for getting this going. This was actually just so mind-opening and thoughtful. And I'm really, really grateful for all of your perspectives. So thank you. And I know there were a lot of questions that we did not get to. And what we will do is make sure we share them with our panelists after and create sort of a hub for being able to answer your questions and keep an ongoing dialogue. So we are definitely sticklers for staying on time here. So thank you for your flexibility there. Lunch is being served right now. So there'll be an opportunity for folks to have bathroom breaks, grab lunch at noon sharp. We are going to be back up on stage with Professor Melissa Murray and Jessica Valenti in our Democracy and Dobbs conversation. So we'll see you back at your seats in 15 minutes. Thank you.